Good day and welcome to AGK's Vinyl Life. I'm your host, Anthony K. And today is Monday, June 15th, 2020. And on this week's episode, we're going to be diving into the wonderful world of pinup, otherwise known as cheesecake, cover art on record albums. And this is going to be volume 1. There's going to be a few volumes of this because there's way too much to cover in one video. But this is volume 1, and in volume 1 I'm going to be looking at cheesecake / pinup cover art from the 50s and 60s. In volume 2 we'll be moving on to the 70s, and volume 3 beyond the 70s. But in this volume we're going to go and look at the roots of cheesecake cover art that was on record albums, mainly jazz. Mostly jazz albums and instrumental albums, surf albums, things like that. In the 50s and 60s, pinup cheesecake cover art was rampant on albums back in the day. And I think before I show any records, we should have a little discussion on what is cheesecake photography or pinup photography or pinup cover art, cheesecake cover art. What is it? Well, I've got Wikipedia here, so I'm going to read right from Wikipedia here so I get the facts straight. A pinup model, known as a pinup girl for the female, is a model whose mass-produced pictures see wide appeal as popular culture. Pinup models may today be referred to as glamour models, fashion models, or actors. Pinups are intended for informal display, meant to be pinned up on a wall. These pictures are also sometimes known as cheesecake photos. Cheesecake was an American slang word that was considered a publicly acceptable term for semi-nude women because pinup was considered too taboo in the early 20th century. The term pinup refers to drawings, paintings, and other illustrations, as well as photographs. And the term was first attested to in English in 1941. However, the practice is documented back to at least the 1890s. Pinup images could be cut out of magazines or newspapers or on a postcard or lithograph. Such pictures often appear on walls, desks, calendars. Posters of pinups were mass-produced and became popular from the mid-20th century. So that is the definitions of pinup or cheesecake. And they show here Betty Grable, famous actress. And she posed for a very famous pinup photo in 1943, one of the earliest pinup photos, and I'll show that one here. There is a classic, by definition, pinup girl or cheesecake photo. So these photos became all the rage in the 50s and 60s on record albums, and girls even to this day are still used on the covers of records albums right up to today. And I'm not talking about the singers, female singers, or members of the band. We're talking about random models that were just chosen for cover art. They had nothing to do with the album, nothing to do with the music, absolutely nothing to do with the album at all, other than to be a pretty face on the album jacket to help sell the record. And this was a very common practice. So where did this all start? Why did jazz albums in the 50s, which is where the majority of them started, why did jazz albums in the 50s all start to have lots of pinup art on it? Which moved into the 60s, and then in the 70s, you even started getting nudes on the covers when thoughts and things and people became more liberal and less centering and more open-minded, and Europe of course was way more open-minded than North America, as I've discussed in my band record covers video. But in the 50s and 60s, what prompted all these pinup girls and cheesecake photos on album covers? Well, I think the biggest reason for it was in 1953, a man by the name of Hugh Hefner created a magazine. That magazine was Playboy, and it became famous for having centerfold models every month of the year, right through until the magazine kind of died in 2016 and kind of was reborn. But the centerfold models started in 1953, and they started with a lady by the name of, and she was the very, very first centerfold pinup girl, whatever you want to call it, for Playboy magazine. She was the very, very first centerfold in the very first issue. And this photograph is famous. I'm going to try to censor it here. But that woman was a woman by the name of Marylin Monroe. That's right, Marylin Monroe, the very first Playboy centerfold in 1953. And it caused such an explosion when she posed. She was just doing, I think, Gentlemen Prefer Blondes. She was just breaking out as a huge actress and sex symbol and starlet. And she was the first Playboy centerfold. And that, to me, I think was the signal and the explosion that caused so much pinup and cheesecake art on record albums. That's my opinion. And even this limited edition pink vinyl record that I got a couple of years ago, and which I've censored. This is Marylin Monroe, The Essential Masters. And this is all of her music. Even though she never recorded an album, she had sung in so many movies. So this is basically a collection of all her music from all her various films. One of two different collections I have of her. And of course, they used the Playboy centerfold that she posed for as the cover on this album. And that is pretty much classic cheesecake pinup art. Marylin Monroe, Essential Masters, basically a greatest hits. But it was that picture that really prompted, and then of course the magazine, Playboy magazine, blew up in the 50s, became a very popular men's magazine, popular all over the world. And album covers started popping out with similar style of, obviously not nude. In the 50s and 60s we didn't get nude, but there was a lot of cheesecake, as they called it, meaning semi-nude. Things were covered, very teasing, seductive. It made people buy the albums. It sold the albums. It definitely sold the albums. And Playboy magazine also featured an artist by the name of Alberto Vargas. And Alberto Vargas, who was born in 1896, was probably the single most famous pinup artist who did pinup drawings and paintings. And he died in 1982, but in I think it was the late 1956, Playboy magazine contracted, made a deal with Alberto Vargas to show his works in every month of their magazine. So from 1956 until 1974, Playboy magazine, or even a little bit after 74, Playboy magazine would have one of Alberto Vargas's cheesecake photos. They're not photos, sorry, cheesecake drawings. Would have one of his drawings in the magazine every month. So another style of cheesecake were cheesecake drawings. They were paintings. And if I can find one here that it's safe to show you, well, I'll just sort of go like this. This is a sample of Alberto Vargas's work. Very lifelike, very beautiful paintings. and they were featured every month in Playboy. Here's another one, and this was actually an Alberto Vargas, and this was a movie poster. So Alberto Vargas, and the reason why I mention his name is when his wife died in 1974, he went into retirement and he stopped painting. He lost his will to paint, stopped painting, but he came out of retirement in 1978 to paint probably one of the most iconic album covers, period. And that is the Cars Candio. And that's from 1978. And that was Alberto Vargas out of retirement to paint this picture for Candio. Probably one of the most famous Cheesecake art photos on any album anywhere. Candio. And that's the only one I'm going to show from the 70s right now because I'm focusing on Cheesecake and pinup stuff from the 50s and 60s. But I just thought I'd give you some history on Cheesecake art and Cheesecake photography. So Cheesecake pinup photography started mainly in the 40s, though it had been around in various forms right from the 1890s. Like I said, Betty Grable becoming one of the most famous pinup photos ever. And then, of course, Marylin Monroe being the first centerfold caused his explosion in the 50s. And Alberto Vargas, of course, another inspirational artist whose works appeared everywhere. And on other albums, he did another album cover for Bernadette Peters as well. After this Cars Candio album cover. So Alberto Vargas, there's a classic Cheesecake art for you. So now we're going to go back 50s and 60s because this is all about the 50s and 60s. And this is volume 1. In volume 1, I'm going to deal with the 50s and 60s, some samples, not everything, because I could sit here for hours and show you Cheesecake and pinup cover art. I could be here all day. I'm just picking some samples. I picked some random samples, about 20 samples here, maybe 15, 20 samples. But let's get on. There's a little history of Cheesecake and pinup photography and art, and the roots of what kind of started it, and why in the 50s and 60s this sort of art was used on album covers. Used to sell the albums. The pictures had nothing to do with the albums at all. They really didn't. But they were used on the albums. Now here's an example. This is a jazz album. This is an example of art, of Cheesecake art. And this is from, I believe, the early 60s, late 50s. I can't get a date on this one. But this is Bohemia After Dark, a great jazz album, absolutely great jazz album, featuring Kenny Clarke on drums, Horace Silver on piano, Paul Chambers on bass, and one of my favorite sax players of all time, Cannonball Adderley on sax. You got Donald Byrd on trumpet, and of course, Nat Adderley, Cannonball Adderley's brother, who played cornet and who played with him. I mean, Paul Chambers played with Cannonball Adderley on a lot of albums too. Hank Jones on piano. Great album, Bohemia After Dark. And there is some Cheesecake cover art. Had nothing to do with the record, but certainly helped sell the record. Strategic placing of the letter B. And that was, late 50s. Another one, here's another one. Now this particular album is from Chet Baker and Art Pepper. Of course, Chet Baker, famous trumpet player. Art Pepper, great sax player. He had Carl Perkins on piano. And this recording came out in 1956. And it was called Playboys. I wonder why it was called Playboys. Playboy magazine 3 years earlier blew up all over the world. And so they even used the Playboy magazine font. Called it Playboys with an S. Used the same font. Even had a Playboy model doing a cheesecake pinup pose for the album cover. Of course, this album cover has nothing to do with the album, but certainly helped sell the album. Chet Baker, Art Pepper, Playboy's 1956 cheesecake pinup cover art. Now, the next album is very famous, and probably anybody should have this album in their collection because it's kind of one of those albums that everybody needs in their collection. And I believe this album's from 1965, if I remember right. And this is definitely probably one of the most famous cheesecake photos used on an album cover. Just as the Candy-O had art, this one was a very famous cheesecake photo. And this is Herb Alpert and the Tijuana Brass, whipped cream and other delights, a classic. Everybody should have this in their collection. And definitely one of the most famous cheesecake album covers of all time is this nude woman covered in whipped cream. But interestingly enough, the only part of this photo that's whipped cream was this here and on the fingers. Because the studio lights were so hot, they would instantly melt the whipped cream. So they had to actually use shaving cream. So it was actually all shaving cream that was done on here. But they did use whipped cream for her to lick her fingers and a little splurch on here. But yeah, the whipped cream would melt under the hot studio lights, so they had to actually use shaving cream. But whipped cream and other delights, probably one of the most famous cheesecake photos ever used on a record album. 1965. Next up, another very popular artist from the 60s and the 70s. And this is an early 60s album. I believe this was this came out, it was recorded between December 1961 and March 1962, released in 1962. Bert Kaempfert and his orchestra. And I love Bert Kaempfert. I love me some Bert Kaempfert every once in a while. And this is his most famous album. It was called A Swingin' Safari. And there we have some more cheesecake. Totally unrelated to anything on the album. This sexy model, doing a classic, what they call cheesecake pose. Pinup models, cheesecake models, they posed a certain way. There were certain poses that were, as soon as you looked at it, you go, oh, there's a cheesecake pose. There's a pinup pose. There's certain poses. And there's another yet classic cheesecake album cover. Bert Kaempfert's famous A Swingin' Safari, a fabulous spin. This is really a fabulous spin. Another one anybody should have in their collection. It's just a fun album. And that was 1962. Next one is from 1958. And this album is very interesting. Definitely, obviously inspired by Playboy magazine and their monthly pinup girls. And this was an album from 1956 again. Here we go, 1956, by a female singer by the name of Julie London. And Julie London released an album called Calendar Girl. That's right, Calendar Girl, in which she posed for all of the paintings on the cover. She posed for every single one of these paintings. January, February, March, April, May, June, July, August, right through. Different poses. Classic cheesecake poses. Calendar Girl. And that was in the tradition of Vargas himself. I don't think these were painted by Vargas. I don't seem to have, it doesn't really talk on here about who painted the photos, but truly in Vargas style. And there was even one more painting on the inside cover. Julie London, Calendar Girl, 1956, classic cheesecake cover. But not only was the cover cheesecake, but even the songs. Every song on the album had to do with a month. So not only was Calendar Girl Julie London doing all these poses, but the songs. Side 1, June and January. February brings the rain. Melancholy March. I'll remember April. People who are born in May. Memphis in June. Sleigh ride in July. Time for August. September in the rain. This October. November twilight. Warm December. And the last song is called The 13th Month. So all the songs, it's just actually a really great spin. It really is a great spin. Really great vocals. Really great album. Real laid back. Nice jazz, vocal jazz. 1956, Calendar Girl by Julie London. Another sample of pinup art, but at least the artist, at least the person on this album was Julie London, who posed for all the pictures herself. Now we have another thing, and this is from, I believe, let's check the date on this, is from originally recorded in 1956 again. And this was the Marty Piach, I hope I'm pronouncing that right, Marty Page Quintet, Jazz for Relaxation. Cheesecake photography on the album cover. 1950s. This is 1950s, mid-50s. Obviously inspired by everything that was going on with, you know, Playboy and whatnot. Cheesecake album cover. No nudity there. Everything's, you know, carefully covered. But Jazz for Relaxation from 1956. Next up. Now this album was by a jazz musician named Pete Rugolo. And I believe this album came out in... Oh, I looked up the date just before I started this video and now I forgot it. I believe this was mid-60s, late 50s, 1959, 1959. So this album came out in 1959, and this is an artist by the name of Pete Rugolo, jazz musician, and this album is called Behind Brigitte Bardot. Brigitte Bardot, very famous sex symbol, French actress, up there with all the greats like Raquel Welch, Farrah Fawcett. She was a sex symbol of the 50s and 60s in French films. One famous film called And God Created Woman. But this album was performed and written by Pete Rugolo, and it was a tribute to Brigitte Bardot, who of course posed for the cover photo. Cheesecake photo on the cover. And Cheesecake photos on the inside of this gatefold. Brigitte Bardot, the actress, but the album was written for, it was a tribute to her. It was written as a tribute to Brigitte Bardot, called Behind Brigitte Bardot. A great album, great spin, really nice relaxing music, sexy, sultry music. Pete Rugolo, Behind Brigitte Bardot. Who, let's see, who had, did we talk about anybody else on this album that was famous? I'm not going to waste time looking up all the musicians on here, but Cheesecake, Brigitte Bardot, definitely probably helped sell that album. The next one is a really unusual. This was released in originally released in 1958, and this is a really, really odd album, in that it's probably one of the earliest sci-fi synthesizer music albums. And this is from 1958. Experimental electronic music, the sort of music you would hear in those 50s and early 60s sci-fi films. And I'll just sort of block this photo a little bit. But this was called Music for Heavenly Bodies. Arrangements by Warren Baker, featuring Paul Tanner, Electro Theremin, Andre Montero, and his orchestra. It's all electronic music. Really, really wild music. It's a really cool spin. It's a really cool spin. Songs were Up to Jupiter, Misty Moon, Midnight Sun, Lost in the Stars, 20th Century Venus, I Wished on the Moon, Sunrise Serenade, Moonlight Serenade, famous song, Moonlight Serenade, his version. an electronic version of it. The Red Sea of Mars, Holiday on Saturn, Over the Rainbow, Out of This World, and The Story of Starry Nights. Music for Heavenly Bodies, once again using Cheesecake cover art. Next up was a group. We're going to look at a little bit of surf music here. Surf music. And one of the most famous instrumental bands of the 60s and 70s. And I love these guys. I have a pile of their albums. Were the Ventures. Guitar-driven instrumental band that did a lot of surf albums, but then they just started doing everything, and they released a pile of albums, absolute pile of albums from in the 1960s and 70s, absolute pile of albums. I love the Ventures. They're great stuff. Got famous doing, of course, surf music, instrumental surf music, but as the 60s went on, they were doing instrumental psych, and then into the 70s, instrumental rock, instrumental disco, everything. So here's this is a collection of all four of their four first albums, their first four albums, mono editions. This is the Ventures, the original studio albums. Once again, pinup girl in a bathing suit, posing by an old car. And this is from the early, these albums were all from the very early 60s, 61, 62. But yeah, pinup girl, washing a car in a bathing suit. Cheesecake, once again. Then another one from the Ventures. And this was Walk Don't Run Volume 2 from 1964. Famous album of theirs. Walk Don't Run Volume 2, The Ventures. And once again, we've got a pinup girl, classic pinup pose on the cover. Obviously there to sell the record. And she actually was, this girl here, was actually the wife of one of the guitarists in the group. She wasn't a model. She was the wife of one of the guitarists in the group who did the pose. 1964. Walk Don't Run Volume 2. Then from 1967, the Ventures, probably one of the Ventures' most famous albums of all time was Hawaii Five-0, with a Hawaiian girl on the cover. And the theme, though they didn't play the theme on the Hawaii Five-0 TV show, they released a single, their version of Hawaii Five-0, which became a huge hit on AM radio. The theme from Hawaii Five-0. And once again. And now this collection is just from a couple of years ago. Another collection. This is a collection of the Ventures music. And this was released in 2013, this collection. But it featured, they kept the art style to the period of the music that's on the album. Even though this collection first was released and compiled and released in 2013, they kept the artwork traditional to where these songs came from originally. And this was the Ventures Singles Collection, a 2013 press, but as you can see, they kept the artwork. Pinup girl, bikini pinup girl on the cover, on the inside. And it was traditional to most of the songs on this LP are from the early 60s. But they kept the artwork to match the period of music. Pinup art once again. Another famous pinup art was an album by a musician named Paul Maurait. A very famous album. And the most famous song on this album that made it so popular, Love is Blue. Love is Blue was Paul Maurait's big hit. And this album is very famous. Great spin. This is a really great spin. Paul Maurait, I believe he was a French musician. And this is his Blooming Hits. And I believe this is from the mid-60s, late 60s. Let's see if I can find a date on this. 1967. Paul Maurait, Bloomin' Hits. More pinup art. And this is a girl that's been body painted for the cover of the album. Paul Maurait, Bloomin' Hits. This is an original press. Original first press. Still in the shrink even. Still in the shrink. Very fortunate to find this. Still in the shrink. First press. More Cheesecake cover art. And another one from the Ventures here. One of the Ventures' most famous albums, a greatest hits collection by the Ventures that sold big. And this is pretty beat up. I'd like to get a better copy of this one day. Find a better quality copy of this one day. But this was the Ventures. Golden Greats by the Ventures. With that classic photo of a pinup model in a gold bikini. Gold bikini. And this was basically, this came out, I believe, in 1967 or 69, something like that, featuring hits from their previous albums. The Ventures, Golden Greats. One day I'm going to find an upgrade copy to this album. But once again, pinup art, Cheesecake photos. And last up here, I have a soundtrack. And this is a soundtrack from originally released in 1956. And I talked about Brigitte Bardot before, inspiring Pete Rugolo to make his album. Well, this is the soundtrack, as released, from And God Created Woman, with Brigitte Bardot on the front cover. Once again, there we have pinup Cheesecake art. This is the original soundtrack from And God Created Woman. And this is a recent reissue. And this movie, if you've never seen it, this movie turned heads. It shook up the film world. It was sexy, sultry. Nobody had seen anything like this until this French actress Brigitte Bardot came along and made this film, a classic film. And God Created Woman. And there you go, pinup cover art again with Miss Brigitte Bardot herself, doing a classic pinup pose, topless, covering her naughty bits. This was a very popular pinup pose. And God Created Woman. So that's just some examples of pinup / cheesecake cover art from the 50s and 60s. I could go on for hours and pull more albums out and show you more. Pinup cheese / cheesecake cover art came out. It's here to stay. It's even to this day. I can show you albums from 2020, 2019 that have cheesecake pinup cover art on them, and I probably will down the line. But I wanted just to focus on the roots of the cheesecake pinup cover art, which is mostly in jazz and instrumental music. And it's still, to this day, a popular form of selling record albums rather than having, just interesting art on the albums or the band's pictures. Sexy girls, barely dressed, apparently sells records. Apparently sells records. Always has and always will. So God bless those cheesecake pinup cover arts. Because I'm sure everybody in the vinyl community, and you'd be lying, all you people out in the vinyl community, you'd be lying to yourself if you didn't at some point buy a record or more than one even, that's in your collection, that when you bought it because you liked the cover. You liked the sexy girl on the cover of the album, and that's the reason you didn't know the album, you hadn't heard the album, but you saw that pinup girl on the cover, and that made you buy the album. And yeah, every single one of you, don't lie to yourselves, has bought an album because of the cheesecake. And you women too. Sexy guy on the album cover. You bought the album because of the sexy guy on the album cover. So we all have fallen victim to pinup girls and cheesecake cover art. And it's just the way the world works. So I hope you enjoyed that. That's volume 1. I am going to be releasing a volume 2. And in volume 2, I don't know when I'm going to do it, in a few weeks. Volume 2, I'm going to jump into the 70s and continue from where I left off today. We're going to go into the 70s, and I'm going to be looking at funk disco, and soul, which of course was a big part of the 70s explosion of music. Funk, disco, soul really exploded in the 70s, and a lot of it used Cheesecake and pinup cover art, such as the Ohio Players. And I'll be showing just about the entire Ohio Players library in that video, who like 99% of their albums all featured sexy pinup girls on the covers. So yeah, Ohio Players will be in that video. And I'll also be in that video, besides in volume 2 in the 70s, another thing that was big in the 70s was overseas jazz, smooth jazz, I think it's called, which became very big in the 70s with artists, especially Italian artists, and of course the covers that came in from Europe and Italy, full nudity, cheesecake, semi-nude, nude. Everybody was doing it over on the other side of the ocean from Canada and the US here. In Europe, it became rampant over there, and it was just the norm. It was normal. And I'll be showing things from Mr. Fausto Papetti, who released close to 40 albums, all with semi-nude and nude women on the covers. Tasteful covers, but Cheesecake, every one of his albums, just about every single one of his albums had Cheesecake. So you'll be seeing this and more in that video, and as I do funk, jazz, funk and soul and disco and some jazz from the 70s, and European jazz, smooth jazz, featuring things like the Italian artist Fausto Papetti and the other Italian artist Gil Ventura, who also released a pile of Cheesecake photos on his album covers. So you'll be seeing those people as well as a whole bunch more, and that's going to be in the next installment of Pinup and Cheesecake album covers. I hope you enjoyed this video. Please like the video, subscribe to my channel. I am really overwhelmed as I'm over 200 subscribers now. In the last 3 weeks, I think it is. In the last 3 weeks, I've gained another 100 subscribers. Blows my mind. Thank you everybody for subscribing and enjoying my videos. So turn the notification little bell thing on so you don't miss my video. I do post a video like this every Monday or Tuesday. I try to have an episode then. And don't forget to follow me on Instagram, where I post pictures of albums every day. And I call it my spin of the day. And I try to have a spin of the day every day on Instagram. And my Instagram, of course, is at AGK_lifetime of vinyl. Check me out there. You can direct message me there. Love to hear your comments and feedback on this album, on this video. Did you enjoy this video? You want to see that 60s, 70s Cheesecake and Pinup art video? Let me know. So thank you everybody for watching once again, and I will see you all next week. Bye for now.